Let's have a little talk.
Yeah, so the reason why I wanted to make this video was because of recent events in the news. Obviously, the passing of George Floyd on May 25th has brought about a new wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's more protests and rallies across the country of the United States, but then also around the world, including here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. The reason why I wanted to talk about it mostly was actually for educational purposes. I find that a lot of serious topics aren't talked about with students and with kids. I say that from my own personal experience. I know growing up, I never had a conversation about race and racism with my parents. No sit down talk, no, dinner, family around the table kind of talk. And my teachers didn't do that either. It wasn't until university that I even really had a conversation with myself about the ideas of racism and systemic racism and prejudice and discrimination. And I think it's really important to know those terms. And the reason why I think it's important to know those terms is because if you know what those terms mean, it's a lot easier to give definition to what everything means overall. Why racism is so important to really talk about. So prejudice is the irrational and unjustifiable kind of feelings that maybe we have towards a person or a thing. So an example could be if I'm in the classroom and I say, if you have a cat, I hate you, right? If you have a dog, I like you. Something totally irrational. It makes no sense at all. Why would I hate somebody based on the fact that they have a cat? It doesn't make any sense. That would be prejudice. The discrimination, that gets built up on that prejudice. So it goes from just that feeling of maybe distrust or dislike for someone, and now it includes a mistreatment of somebody. So instead of saying, I just dislike you because you have cats, it's I'm going to purposefully exclude you from my birthday party because you like cats. And the racism that comes in, that involves discrimination and prejudice, but then in an area of race, culture, and religion. And the reason why I bring in religion is because faith has a huge aspect of culture for a lot of peoples around the world. Now, if you don't follow any faith or religion, then it might not impact you at all. But for people who do follow a faith or practice a religion, faith is a huge part of their identity. And people who might be, let's say, Jewish or Muslim, if you were to discriminate or be prejudiced towards them based off of their faith, you're probably going to be discriminating or prejudiced about their culture as well, because their culture revolves around that faith that they practice. And that just builds in, then also including the race, and then it just basically becomes a discrimination against a whole person because of something that they believe in. And so racism becomes this unnatural dogma or belief system that people have, where one person is better than one other person, or there's a hierarchy of people, and where you fit in depends on what you believe in and what you look like. And that's what we're kind of seeing right now happen with the Black Lives Matter movement, which started well before the passing of George Floyd. However, I think because of the fact that COVID-19 is happening right now, people are kind of stuck in their homes, we have a lot more access to social media, to the news, to friends and family talking about topics like this. And in these conversations, we're learning more about things like Black Lives Matter, and we're starting to realize just how important and why it's important to maybe be allies for these people who are protesting and rallying in the streets. They're not protesting and rallying against simply that a police officer killed an unarmed black man. They're rallying in the streets because there's an inequality that's experienced by people of color and black people, especially in the United States. And in Canada, that inequality is more so experienced by people of color and Indigenous peoples within Canada. And there's an inequality that happens just because of something as silly as the color of our skin. And talking about the inequality, fighting against it, fighting for equity and equality for peoples, that's what the Black Lives Matter movement's about. Yes, they're talking about police officers mistreating people also. And that has to do more with systemic racism and how the racism permeates different aspects of our society, whether that be education and how we only learn one perspective of how European settlers came to Canada or the United States and made it their home by referring to the inhabitants there already as savages and seeing them as half people. It's also in our law court systems where we see that there's a higher percentage of indigenous peoples or black people in prisons. Why there's more indigenous or black peoples who are homeless? Why is it there's a higher percentage of them struggling in the lower income neighborhoods than, let's say, another race? So the reason why I wanted to talk about all of this was because of the fact that it's being brought up much more into our faces now. Racism has always been there. It's not like it just kind of popped in once COVID-19 started. It's always been there, but I think now is the time where people are starting to say, enough's enough. When is this going to stop? Because it's 2020 and we're still experiencing things that our parents and grandparents have experienced. Now, when I think of racism personally, as I mentioned, I didn't have that conversation with my parents. I did, however, hear about experiences that my mom went through in growing up in Canada and how the racism that she experienced was based, yes, just because of the fact that she looked different from the other kids in her class. I kind of felt that same racism experience myself. What happened differently with me, though, was instead of people outwardly telling her that she wasn't a good person or she wasn't of value because of the color of her skin, I started internalizing an inferiority complex on myself, basically saying that because of the fact that I was brown, I was less than. And I felt that early in my childhood. I didn't know what that meant, but I could easily see that all my friends, they were either white, they were maybe East Asian, maybe there's the one or two black kids in the class, but for the most part, there weren't really any brown kids. And so I started seeing that, well, why am I different from everybody else? Why is it that my family has to pray 5 times a day at home? Why do we have to fast for a month? Why do I have to go to a mosque when my friends are going to a church? And so because of the fact there's no conversation I ever had, I started kind of idealizing this idea that, well, if you're white and there's this kind of lifestyle and you go to church and you do these things and you don't do all these things that my family's doing, then you're normal. And I wanted to be that normal. I would see my brown skin and be upset with it. I would go into a shower or bathtub, and when it was time to clean, I would get a loofah and scrub as hard as I could, trying to get as much of the skin off as I could, thinking that maybe if I got rid of the darkness, then I'd become a bit more normal. And I hated summer for that reason, because I knew in the summer I'd turn super dark, right? The melanin in my skin, it just turned my skin darker. I didn't get sunburns, yay. But I would get darker, and I didn't like that until the winter months when I'd get lighter again. And that racism kind of perpetuated. There's this idea that racism only has to be from one race against another race. But I know for myself, a lot of that also came from just within the race itself. Growing up, yes, I've experienced racism from other people telling me things based off the color of my skin, or telling me, mistreating me, or making jokes about me in convenience stores, or my parents being terrorists and things like that. But I've also experienced racism seen racism from people within the South Asian community itself. Something as simple as the color of our skin. In the South Asian community, unfortunately in Pakistan and India specifically, there is a caste system based off the color of your skin. Now, I say based off the color of your skin only because it also does take that into account. Basically, the darker you are, you're told that you have less value, you have less opportunities, you're uglier, you're less desirable, and the lighter skin you are, the better you are. And we have celebrities, South Asian celebrities, same celebrities who right now might even be kind of talking about Black Lives Matter, who are sponsored by these creams or these beauty products which target young men and women, more specifically women, saying, hey, right now you're dark, don't you want to be lighter and live a happy life? Well, put this cream on your skin and you will become lighter. Things like Fair and Lovely. There's this obsession with lightness. We could probably go back in time and put this as the starting of when British colonizers came to India and attempted to make it their own and became the ideal version of what a person should be and what they should look like. However, when they left, that belief remained. And still to this day, we still see that there's people who are mistreated just because of the color of their skin, the shade of darkness of their skin, by people of their own race. So this has less to do now with the fact that someone hundreds of years ago came in and told you you're not worthy because you're dark. And now it's people who look just like them telling them that they're not worthy because of their darkness. And it's not just something that happens in India, because it's something that happens here in Canada too. And I've heard it within other families and in my family too, where I see that my brother and I, when we're little kids, making jokes about how dark we were. And then when we see our sister, who is extremely fair-skinned like our mother, we would all talk about how she had so much value just because of the fact that she had lighter skin, which doesn't make any sense when you really think about how we put all this value on her as a human being just because of the fact that she's lighter skin. So that racism that does exist within a society as a whole, and with maybe, white people and people of color, it does also exist within the cultures themselves. And when we talk about racism, it's important to talk about that there is racism happening between and within cultures also. Because if we only talk about what's happening between two different races or two different groups of people, then we're completely ignoring the fact that there's other problems and other instances of racism that exist in the world also that need to be addressed. Now, like I said, as a child, racism for me was more of an inferiority complex. I didn't want to be the color I was. I hated everything that had to do with the color of my skin, and some of that had to do with the fact that the people that I saw as representatives of my culture were not healthy examples of what it meant to be a Pakistani man or a Pakistani woman. They weren't good examples. And it was only maybe as I got older when I started actually forcing myself to experience the perspectives of other people like Malala Yousafzai, right? She's sure an example that is used quite a bit in terms of a good example of a Pakistani person, but that was somebody who I read about, and then all of a sudden there was a switch in my head saying, wow, there's somebody who looks like me, who has cultural backgrounds to the same country that my parents are from, that I have heritage from, and look how amazing they are. They're coming from a family where the father is fighting for his daughter's education, who shows love and affection, who isn't abusive. There's all this greatness that kind of came from one family here that I never really opened myself up to. And yes, I may have seen and experienced some of that negative stuff as a child, seeing those people or people in my family act the way they did, and the community act the way they did. But that doesn't mean that I should label an entire community based off a small minority. That's kind of what I've experienced as an adult too, where the actions of us few now seem to have reverberations or ripples against everybody else in the community. As an adult now, when I think of racism, I think of the fear that comes out of me. I think about how when I was traveling for 4 months, halfway around the world, reading in the news that there was a terrorist attack, I believe it was within Canada. And the first thought that came to my mind wasn't, oh my gosh, I hope those people are okay. My first thought was, oh God, are my mom, my sister, my brother, or my father going to be facing repercussions because of this? Are they going to be attacked out of some sort of barbaric retaliation because somebody felt, well, it was your people that did this thing, I want to hurt people who look just like them and you look like them? And so immediately my first thought was, oh my gosh, message my family and see, are you guys okay? Please be careful when you go out. Don't do anything that would, bring attention. If people say something, just ignore them and run, walk away, run away, get some help. That's what we've seen our whole lives. From the days of 9/11 to now, I've seen and heard about people that look like me getting hurt and attacked only because they looked like someone else, because of the fact that they had dark skin, because of the fact that they maybe had an accent. So nowadays, when I think of racism, I think of that idea of how one person can affect so many other people without even realizing it, and it all has to do with our perceptions. An example that comes to mind is a few years ago, like 2017, when I was walking down the street with this white woman, and I was kind of lagging behind because I was looking at something in a window or whatever, and I kind of was speed walking up to her. And as I was speed walking up to her, I guess, and I didn't know this until afterwards, a police officer came up in their cruiser, parked behind me, stepped out, and was walking towards me. And it wasn't until the woman I was with shook her head that the officer went away. I didn't know that because I'm not a very observant person until she told me that. And when she told me that, the first thing that popped in my head was, oh man, weird. Like, I wasn't wearing a hoodie or anything. I wasn't wearing baggy clothes. And thinking about that now, it scares me knowing that, geez, even what I'm seeing in the news, even what I'm reading on social media, even what I'm hearing around me, despite the fact that I'm a person of color, I have my mind has allowed me to accept all of that as factual or worthy information to judge a person. I basically told myself that, well, I don't know why they were afraid that I was going to do something because I didn't look a certain way. I wasn't asking for it because I wasn't wearing those clothing, right? Those pieces of clothing. I was wearing a buttoned up flower shirt, green pants, and a small blue backpack over one shoulder. It was later at night, sure, but there was nothing about me that looked different, so why would they do that? And I didn't think about just the ramifications of what that actually meant. And even now, as a married person to my beautiful wife who is white, I'm noticing that there are those ideas of bigotry and racism becoming more prevalent. I'm not observant again, but my wife, she notices when people kind of turn around unexpectedly or kind of give us a stink eye or a little glare. And it's not always just from people who are white. It's also from people from the brown community as well, the South Asian community also, who maybe take a look at my tattoos and be like, well, that's not part of our culture. Or he's married to a white woman, or he's with a white woman. That's not part of our culture. That's wrong. We should treat him differently. Or what? He came from a Muslim family, but he's not Muslim. That's wrong. He's going to go to hell. There's so much bigotry, so much prejudice and discrimination that happens within a culture. Without a culture, it terrifies me now because I'm scared of what she's going to experience, my wife is going to experience from people because of the fact that she's married to me. And I'm afraid that if we ever do have children, then those children, I hope, and I honestly am afraid. I'm a little afraid if they look like me. I'm afraid that if they look as dark as me, then they're going to experience some scary things. Because I've been pretty fortunate in terms of, I say it's fortunate, it's kind of crazy that I say it's fortunate, but the racism I've experienced throughout my life, nothing has become super violent out of it. Nobody has attempted to beat me up because of the color of my skin, but that could happen to anybody else. And to think that there's even a possibility that could potentially happen to a future kid just because of the color of their skin or the fact that they look more like me and less like my wife, that scares me because it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that we continue to go through our lives fearful and plan our lives out knowing or believing that there's a scarier end to it just because of the way we look. Right now in Canada, there's a conversation happening where RCMP officers are in the light, being told that there is systemic racism amongst the RCMP. This is not an attack on police officers. I have no personal vendetta against them. I've been very fortunate in that the times that I have experienced personal interaction with police officers or actually being helped by police officers, that I have been treated with utmost respect. But again, just like with the protests that we see, there is a minority of people that are definitely showcasing what the negative attributes could be of a group. So right now that the conversation we're having of systemic racism within the RCMP cohort of officers across Canada, that's a real thing. There is systemic racism, and it acts in the same way that we see the violent minority of protesters who are marring the entire Black Lives Matter movement. There is definitely a population of police officers who act in racial or racist ways, maybe not towards people that look like me, maybe not towards people who are black, but most definitely towards people who are Indigenous. And it's seen not just in how police officers might treat someone who's Indigenous, but in how our justice system deals with people who are Indigenous. You know, why is it that there is a higher population of Indigenous peoples in our prisons? Why is it that there's a higher population of Indigenous peoples on the streets, homeless? Why is it that there's a higher population of Indigenous children in our foster care system? Why is it that in Canada we have Indigenous people living on land where they aren't able to get clean drinking water? When I'm able to go to the kitchen sink in the other room right now and grab a bottle of water without even thinking about it for a second. Why is it that that's still a thing in the year 2020. And so when we talk about systemic racism, it's not just about that overt, I don't like you because of the way you look, or you need to go back to whatever country you came from. I'm talking about how racism has seeped into parts of our society, affect a person as they thrive and live and can actually exist within a society. It's not right that in our education system, at least here in Alberta, students aren't taught proper information about residential schools or the 60s scoop until much later, maybe past high school even. We're given one perspective on Canadian society and this idea that our country came to be only when these European settlers came in and divided the land up into 13 territories and provinces. No, there was a group of peoples that were here before them, and there's a group of peoples still here even after. And those Indigenous peoples have not had their stories told in the same way that European settlers have. And so 100% there's systemic racism within Canada, and there is systemic racism at every level of Canada, whether that be through justice, whether that be through education, whether that be through how our people are being treated at the city level, at the provincial level, at the federal level. Systemic racism is unfortunately a building block of this nation, and it's up to us right now to kind of start to dismantle that and replace it with ideas and beliefs and values and people who stand for those ideas, beliefs, and values that really look at everyone as being equal, to provide equity for people, not just equality, not just equal rights, but equal opportunity, making sure that voices are heard, making sure that equal opportunities are had, making sure that the basic needs of people are met, making sure that drinking water isn't something that we still have to fight for in what's Canada now. Systemic racism is an example of racism, and there's so many different things that need to happen for racism to be seen as non-existent. And I don't think it could ever be non-existent until massive changes are made within our society and us as a people. A friend of mine recently kind of asked in our little WhatsApp group chat, it's basically saying, do you think racism is going to end? And we're just kind of having a conversation about that. And honestly, I don't think racism ever could end. And it has to do with the fact that racism is something that is learned. As long as there is someone being taught that you can treat someone else differently, or you're better than someone else, or someone else is better than someone else because of the fact that they look different or that they have a different culture or belief system, racism will continue. And so it's up to us as individuals and people of color, people who are allies, all included in that, to make a difference in terms of making changes in our own lives and how we treat other people and how we see other people and how we stand up for other people, but then also standing up to the injustice of systemic racism. Systemic racism is something that needs to be dismantled. And for it to be dismantled, we need to be able to be proud enough or strong enough to say what we're experiencing, what other people are experiencing that I maybe not, is wrong. And we need to fix that right now. And people are doing that right now, but it's a slow change. And we need to be able to choose leaders then who are not going to just say racism is bad, because we all know it's bad then, but to actually make changes towards what would be better if there was no racism. What would be better if people were treated differently? What would be better if there was actual equity and there wasn't just equality, right? Not just equal rights, but equal opportunity as well to thrive and survive in a society. That's what we need to see. When a person can go down the street and go for a run and not be afraid that they're going to be hurt or they're going to be judged or arrested or something like that just because of the color of their skin, or when someone can walk down a street late at night wearing a hoodie and be okay and not be profiled, or if someone can marry someone else who's of a different race and not feel afraid for them and for their future offspring and think about, oh my gosh, my entire future here is now affected because of my race. If that can happen, then we've definitely made changes. And those are just examples related to me. There's tons of examples I'm probably not even thinking of that if racism were to be slowly eradicated or definitely have less of a foothold on society, there would probably be things that would be better for people overall.